Welcome back. So, in the last lecture I started talking about financial swaps, and I introduced the concept of swap as an exchange. It is actually an exchange of a stream of cash flows. One party agrees to exchange a stream of cash flows for another stream of cash flows. Basically the process involves the two streams involve such a phenomenon that one stream is independent of a particular or a specific market variable. One stream is independent of the market variable, which whatsoever that underlying variable may be, and this other stream that is exchanged has a functional dependence on that market variable. And it is so organized, or it is so structured that both the parties benefit from the exchange, and that is why they enter into the swap. So, the important thing here is there are two important things. One is that it is not a single cash flow that is being exchanged, it is a sequence of cash flows, a series of cash flows that is exchanged, and more importantly, one of the series of cash flows is usually the independent of a particular market variable, which is identified by the swap contract, and the other cash flow is dependent in some sense on that market variable. The most common swap that we encounter is the interest rate swap, where one party agrees to pay on certain specified rates and so on. There are nuances there, but one party basically agrees to pay interest on a certain notional principal. Remember, the principal is usually not exchanged, but that particular figure is kept in mind, just like we have the concept of face value in the case of a bond. Similarly, we have a notional principal in the case of a swap, and interest is calculated on the basis of that notional principal. One party agrees to pay interest at a fixed rate, and the other party agrees to pay interest on the same principal at a rate which is fixed in accordance with a certain benchmark. That benchmark may be a LIBOR, that benchmark may be a prime rate, it may be a T-bill yield, or whatever the case may be. So, but how the cash flows are computed, what are the nuances? For example, the day count fraction which is going to apply to the fixed rate and the floating rate are all embedded in the swap contract. So, that forms the substratum of the swap, which contains all the requisite content for determining unambiguously the cash flows that need to be exchanged at various future dates. As I mentioned, the most common type of swap is the interest rate swap, although of course we have currency swaps as well. We can have a swap based on a market price of an underlying commodity and so on. Then I also talked about forward contracts being examples of swaps. It is quite clear, it is quite simple to understand. In fact, you see, what is a forward contract? Suppose this is t equal to 0, and I enter into a forward contract whereby I buy a certain 1 unit of a certain asset for a certain price. Let us call it the strike price, and let us give it the name k. So, on the date of maturity of the forward contract, let us say it is capital T, I will pay an amount k and I will receive 1 unit of the asset. This is what I will receive. Now, obviously, I can sell it in the market at the then prevailing price, let us call it S t, and to get a cash equivalent, which is S t. In other words, what does it tantamount to this forward contract? It tantamounts to an exchange of cash flows where I am paying a fixed amount k and I am receiving an amount which is based on the market price of the underlying asset, which is S t. So, this again is an exchange of cash flows where one cash flow is independent of the market and the other cash flow is dependent on the market price. Typical constituents of a swap. Now, before I get into swaps, you see, swaps are essentially as I mentioned, a series of exchange of cash flows. The most common swaps, as again I just mentioned, are the interest rate swaps. So, interest rate swaps involve a series of cash flow exchanges where one of them pays fixed rate interest, the second one pays floating rate interest. One single exchange is also traded, and that is called a forward rate agreement. So, in a sense, a forward rate agreement is an agreement between two parties. The buyer of the agreement agrees that let me explain it with a diagram. I have it here. The buyer of the agreement, suppose the agreement is negotiated at t equal to t0. The buyer of the agreement then agrees to pay a fixed rate of interest on a certain principal amount. As I said, it is similar to face value, on a certain principal amount, let us call it L, for a loan of that principal amount between the time interval t1 to t2, where t1 is later than t0, at the rate which is fixed at t0. Let me repeat, the buyer of the agreement at the point at which the agreement is negotiated and finalized, that is t0, agrees to pay an interest which is fixed at this point t0 on a certain amount of loan which is notional, which is not exchanged in fact, for the period from t1 to t2, where t1 is future, is later than t0, and t2 of course is later than t1, and t2 is the point at which the agreement concludes. That is what the obligation of the buyer. What about the obligation of the seller? The seller also agrees to make an interest payment. The seller agrees to make an interest payment. The agreement is obviously made at t0. However, the rate at which the seller is going to calculate his interest payment to the buyer shall be determined at t1. It shall not be determined at t0 when the agreement is negotiated. It will be floating for the interval between t0 and t1. It will remain undetermined between t0 and t1. It will be crystallized at t1 in accordance with then prevailing market rate, whatever the benchmark is in the agreement, and it will be fixed at t1, and the seller of the agreement will then pay interest on the same notional principal for the period from t1 to t2, worked out at the interest rate t, that is finalized at t1. So, in that sense it is floating, but it is floating in the sense that it is fixed at the beginning of the point at which the loan is deemed to be dispersed, and it is of course concluded when the agreement is concluded, or when the loan is deemed to be concluded. So, a forward rate agreement is an over the counter agreement. In other words, it can be tailored between the two parties, subject to negotiation, and as I mentioned, it determines the rate of interest between the two parties. So, the buyer of the agreement pays a fixed rate. That fixed rate, why it is called fixed? Because it is fixed at the time of negotiation of the agreement. The seller of the agreement pays a floating rate. Floating in the sense that it is not fixed at the date of negotiation of the agreement, but it is fixed at a date of disbursement of the loan, or deemed a disbursement of the loan at a future date, and it concludes, of course, both the interests will be for the period t1 to t2, same period. Now, of course, there may be issues relating to day count, but they would be contained in the forward rate agreement itself, whether the actual upon 365 is to be used, actual upon 360 is to be used, or the fixed rate party is going to pay actual upon 365 basis, and the floating rate party is to pay actual upon 360 basis. Whatever it is, it would be part of the agreement itself. So, the underlying, what is the no, it is a derivative. So, what is the underlying? The underlying is the interest rate applicable to a notional principal. This notional word is important, it is not physically exchanged, for a lending borrowing transaction negotiated at t equal to t0, that is what I mentioned, scheduled for a future interval t1 to t2. So, the loan is deemed to be initiated or deemed to be disbursed at t1 and deemed to be concluded or deemed to be repaid at t2. It is an OTC agreement. Long party is the party paying the fixed rate, and short party is the party paying the floating rate. Now, let us look at the payoff. Payoff is rather straightforward to calculate. If RK is the fixed rate that is agreed upon by the party that is long to the agreement, the party who has bought the agreement, then its payment of interest will, L is the notional principal, L into RK, RK is the fixed interest rate into the time period which is T2 minus T1. And the loan is deemed to be in existence for the period T2 minus T1. So, the interest outflow from the perspective of the long party will be minus sign indicates that it is an outflow L R K T2 minus T1, and payment by the short party. Now, the short party is let us call it the market rate, because it is the rate that is determined at the beginning of the loan disbursement, deemed disbursement, that is at T1, and that occurs that gives you L R M T2 minus T1. Please note, we are ignoring day count issues to keep the exposition simple, to keep the exposition tractable. So, we are ignoring day count issues, but payment by the short party is this much, payment by the long party is this much, and therefore, the net payment by the long party becomes the difference of the two, and this will be the amount. Now, the important thing is, so this is the net payoff that will be, if you are talking from the perspective of the long party, this is what it will pay, this is what it will receive. So, the net payment that the long party will make is given by this amount. Obviously, it can be positive, it can be a cash outflow, it can be a cash inflow, depending on whether R K turns out to be greater than R M or R K turns out to be less than R M. It depends. You see, R M is a fluctuating quantity, R M is not determined at T0, it is determined at T1. So, this amount will in fact be determined at T1, but the important thing is that although this amount is determined at T1 when R M is determined, when R M is fixed, when the floating rate is fixed for the loan from T1 to T2, the important thing is that this cash flow will actually take place at the end of the loan period, that is at T2. The exchange of this cash flow is supposed to take place at the end of the loan period. In other words, the floating rate is fixed in advance and paid in arrears. In fact, all interest rates, the common practice is that the rates are fixed in advance and the interest is actually paid in arrears, or the interest is actually paid at the end of the loan, or not at the inception loan. That is the usual practice. There can be variation again, but the usual practice is that this payoff would be at the end of the loan, that is at T2. So, suppose you want to settle it at T1, you will obviously work the present value of this at what rate? At the current rate, and the current rate happens to be R M. So, you work out the present value of this net cash flow in terms of the present value, which is 1 plus R M into T2 minus. So, this is the amount of amount that will be exchanged between the long party and the short party, and this exchange will take place at T1. This is again a practice that the exchange, instead of being made at T2, the exchange is actually made at T1, although technically the exchange should have been made at T2, because the interest is paid at the end of the loan period in such scenarios. So, here is a small example. Consider a FRA where we will receive a rate of 6%, this is a fixed rate, we will receive a rate of 6% measured with annual compounding and pay LIBOR on a principal of $100 million, this is the notional principal $100 million, between the end of year 2 and the end of year 3. In other words, this FRA operates between end of year 2 and end of year 3, and calculate the payoff at the end of year 2, at the beginning of the period to which it operates. The current 2-year and 3-year spot rates are so much, 3% and 4%. Now, the given spot rates are, for 2 years it is 3%, for 3 years it is 4%. Therefore, the implicit forward rate, you see these are two spot rates. By using the concept of no arbitrage, we can work out the implicit forward rate for the period from the end of the second year to the end of the third year, that I have denoted by F23, and that comes to be 6%. But that 6% is continuous compounding. Because the fixed rate is to be paid with annual compounding, we convert this continuous compounding rate also to annual compounding basis, so that they are comparable, and the annual rate works out to 6.18365%, corresponding to this forward rate of 6% between the year 2 and year 3. The notional principal is 100 million, the fixed rate is this much. Therefore, the difference is fixed rate is 6%, the floating rate is 6.18%. Therefore, the difference is about 0.18%. Apply it on 100 million, and this is what the payoff will be. The present value, no, this payoff should occur at the end of the third year. As I mentioned, interest payments are always made or usually made at the end of the period to which the loan relates. So, we need to bring it back to the beginning of the period, because if you want to settle the FRA at the beginning of the point at which the loan is deemed to be disbursed, then you have to work out the present value, and that present value works out to 17.29 0.1729 million. And the rate that you would use for bringing it back would be the rate that is prevailing in the market at the end of 2 years for the period 2 to 3 years, which is nothing but the forward rate. Another interesting issue, valuation of the forward rate agreement after inception. As we know, in the case of a forward contract, which FRA is also a forward contract, in the case of a forward contract, the value of the forward contract on the date of inception is 0. However, as time passes, because of fluctuation in the market variables that influence the price of the underlying asset, substratum of the forward contract, the forward contract acquires a positive or a negative value. In fact, it is a zero sum game. So, the positive value for one party to the contract will obviously translate to a negative value for the other party to the contract. So, let us consider FRA A, which is executed at t equal to 0, that pays the fixed rate RA for a loan deemed loan of amount L, the loan principal is L, and the FRA operates for the time interval T1 to T2, and obviously the floating rate is RM, as we have been denoting earlier. There is another FRA B, which is executed at T dash. This is executed at t equal to 0, B is executed at t equal to t dash. It pays the strike rate or the fixed rate RB against RM. RM is common to both of them. In fact, RM will be common, because RM would be fixed at the point at which the loan commences, which is going to be, and we assume that the date of commencement of the loan and the date of conclusion of the loan is the same in both cases. So, T1 and T2 are identical for both the FRAs. We need to value FRA A on t equal to t dash. Obviously, there are two things. FRA A value at t equal to 0 is 0, and similarly FRA B's value at t equal to t dash is also equal to 0. What we do is we construct a portfolio consisting of a long position in A, FRA A, and a short position in portfolio B, FRA B. Then A pays fixed RA and A receives RM. That is the contract FRA A. B, because you are short, B will receive RB and B will pay RM, because you are taking a short position in FRA B. So, you will receive the floating rate and you will pay the floating rate and you will receive the fixed rate. Long position pays the fixed rate, short position receives the fixed rate. So, B receives the fixed rate RB and pays RM. So, the net receipt by A is R. See, on this portfolio, the net receipt will be L into RB minus RA. You see, you are receiving RB and you are paying RA. RM and RM cancel inter se. On one FRA you are receiving RM, on the other FRA you are paying RM. So, they will simply cancel out, and so the net result is that on this portfolio, this combined portfolio which consists of long position in A and short position in B, you receive RB and you pay RA. So, the net inflow on this portfolio is L RB minus RA into T2 minus T1. Now, remember this amount is supposed to be received at T equal to T2. So, what will be the whatever is the present value of this at T equal to T dash will be the value of the FRA A. Why? Because the value of FRA B is 0 at T dash. It has been initiated, it has been negotiated at T dash, and therefore, its value at T dash is 0. Therefore, the value of this portfolio consisting of long A and short B at time T dash is equal to the value of portfolio A only, value of FRA A only. Why? Because FRA B has 0 value at T equal to T dash. So, that being the case, we simply work out the present value, and this works out to be the value of FRA A at T equal to T dash. Now, let us talk about swaps. We have talked about FRAs. Now, let us talk about interest rate swap. As I mentioned, a FRA is an exchange of a fixed rate payment and a floating rate payment. If we have a series of such exchanges, in other words, if we have a series of FRAs at equal periodic intervals, then it constitutes a swap, interest rate swap. Therefore, what can we say of an interest rate swap? Interest rate swap is an exchange of a series of cash flows, where each of those series of cash flows has the characteristic that one of the series of cash flows is fixed or independent of the market variable, which in this case is the interest rate, whatever that interest rate is, and the other cash flows, the floating rate cash flows, they are related to a market variable, in this case for example, the LIBOR or whatever that dynamic variable is. So, party A pays a fixed rate in the sense that that rate is fixed at the time of negotiation of the swap, and floating rate in the sense that that rate is fixed at the beginning of every period to which it relates, and that particular rate which is fixed at the beginning of that period will be used for calculating interest during that interval. I will take it up with an example to make the exposition clear. Just look at this, an agreement by XYZ to receive 6-month LIBOR. XYZ will receive 6-month LIBOR and pay a fixed rate of 5% per annum compounded semi-annually every 6 months for 3 years. So, what does it mean? What does it mean? Let us say this is T equal to 0. This is the day when the swap agreement is negotiated, and let us say this is T equal to T0. At this point, the agreement starts to operate, the swap starts to operate, and the swap is of 3 years. So, let us say this is equal to T equal to T0 plus 3, and it says that every 6 months there will be an exchange of cash flows, 6, 12, 18, 24. So, every 6 months there will be an exchange of cash flows. This is the date on which the agreement is negotiated, and this is the date the swap comes into operation, and thereafter cash flows are exchanged at the end of every 6 months from this date. So, for example, this will be T0 plus 6 months, that is plus 0.5 years, and so on. Now, the fixed rate is the rate. In this problem it is 5%. The fixed rate is fixed at this point and operates for the entire life of the swap. It will not be changed. What about the floating rate? What is the floating rate that it says? It says the floating rate will be 6-month LIBOR. right. So, for the first period, the floating rate will be fixed at this point when the swap comes into existence, and whatever is the then prevailing LIBOR that is on this date shall operate as the rate at which interest is to be calculated on the notional principal L for the period this period to this period, 6-month period from t equal to t0 to t equal to t0 plus 0.5. The 6-month period, the floating rate will be calculated at the LIBOR rate which is fixed at t equal to t0. The fixed rate is fixed at the date of negotiation. These two may coincide, of course, t equal to 0 and t equal to t0 could well coincide, there is nothing wrong with that. They may coincide, they may not coincide. You may negotiate a swap and that starts from the next day or the next week, whatever it is, or it may start even from the same day. So, whatever that situation is, and that will be the relation between t equal to 0 and t equal to t0, they may be the same day, I repeat. So, whatever it is, but the basic thing is the fixed rate will be fixed on the date the swap is finalized. Then what happens at this point t equal to t0 plus 0.5, interest is calculated on this principal L at the rate of 5% per annum, that is 2.5% for this period, and also at the rate of LIBOR for the 6-month period, and whatever is the net cash flow between the two parties is exchanged. And at the same time, the LIBOR which is prevailing at t0 plus 0.5 is then fixed for the next 6-month period. So, the next 6-month period interest, that is t equal to t0 plus 0.5 to t equal to t0 plus 1, interest will be paid at the rate which is fixed at t equal to t0 plus 0.5, that is at this point. However, the fixed leg will remain unchanged. It will be continue to be paid at 5% per annum, that is 2.5% for every 6 monthly period. So, the fixed leg will again at t equal to t0 plus 1, fixed leg will again pay rate at the rate 2.5%. The floating leg, the LIBOR leg will pay at the rate which was fixed at t equal to t0 plus 0.5, and the net flow will be exchanged, and this is the way the process will continue. And this is the working. You can see this. Let us assume that the swap starts on 5th March 2019, and let us assume that LIBOR as on this date is 4.20 per annum, of course. So, it translates to 2.10 for the half year. So, the floating payment that it receives is 2.10, but it has to pay fixed at 5% per annum, that is 2.50. Therefore, it makes a net payment of this amount. Now, at this point in time, then on this payment will 4.20% which was fixed on March 5, which was the date of initiation of the swap, operates for the first 6 months, but as on the next 6 months, again the LIBOR is because the LIBOR changes, the interest rate on the floating leg is also changed. See, the floating rate is nothing but the LIBOR. Now, because the LIBOR has changed from 4.20% to 4.80%, therefore, the interest rate for the next 6 months, that is from September 5 to March 5, September 5 2019 to March 5 2020, the interest would be paid at 4.80, and that is 2.40 because it is for the half year 6 months. And remember, look at this, the fixed rate is still at 5%, you are paying 2.50, you are 2.50, you are receiving this amount, the net payment goes. Now, what happens? As on this date March 5 2020, the LIBOR rate has gone up to 5.30. Therefore, the next payment, that is on September 5 2020, will be made at the rate fixed on March 5 2020, which is 5.30%, and that would be equal to 2.65. You will receive 2.65 because you are the floating rate receiver, and you will pay 2.50, that will continue to be at 5%, that is 2.5% for the half year, and that is the net payment in this case will be an inflow to you, because the floating rate has increased. So, this is the way this swap operates. The important thing is, there are two important things: floating rate changes with every reset date, and that reset is made at the beginning of a period, not at the end of the period, and the interest is actually transferred or actually paid at the end of the period. Rate is fixed at the beginning of the 6-month period and interest is paid at the end of the period. This difference, please note this: beginning of the period, end of the period. Now, see, this exchange that we talked about can also be interpreted as, or can also be, because the notional principal in both the cases is the same, we can simply add that notional principal to the final cash flows, and therefore, if you look at these cash flows now, this cash flows nothing but the cash flows that you would receive by holding a floating rate bond, and these are the cash flows if you have issued a floating rate fixed rate bond. If you have issued a fixed rate bond, you pay periodic interest at the at every 6-monthly intervals at a fixed rate, and you redeem the principal on maturity of the bond. Similarly, if you have invested in a floating rate bond, you will receive interest at the floating rate, and at the end of the maturity period of the bond, you will receive the principal. So, that is precisely what is happening. So, in other words, the interest rate swap can also be viewed as an exchange of a floating rate bond and a fixed rate bond. Instead of just talking about cash flows or FRAs, we can also consider, or we can also interpret a FRA as an exchange of a floating rate bond and a fixed rate bond. Now, another example, this is probably far more instructive. We have got two institutions. One is a company BBB Limited. The names have a significance, we will come back to it. The other is a bank AAA Limited. Both are in requirement of funds. BBB Limited requires 5-year fixed rate dollar funding, and AAA Bank requires floating rate dollar funding. Now, if they have approached their merchant bankers, and the merchant bankers have advised them that the cost of fixed rate borrowings, if BBB enters the market with a fixed rate instrument, fixed rate bonds, it will have to pay 8% per annum. And if AA bank approaches the market for a fixed rate funding, it can get the same kind of funding at 6.5%. As far as floating rate is concerned, BBB can get prime plus 0.575%, AAA can get at prime rate, the floating rate funding. That is, if the BBB approaches the market with a floating rate bond issue, it can issue the bond at prime plus 0.75%, AAA can issue bonds at prime rate. Right. So, this is the situation. So, what now let us look at this. If in the normal case, what would happen is BBB would approach the market for a fixed rate borrowing, it has to pay 8%, and AA would approach the market and pay prime, because it wants floating rate. So, it borrows at floating rate, BBB wants fixed rate and borrows at fixed rate. So, the total cost of both the entities together works out to 8% plus prime, Now, let us see what happens if the situation is reversed. In other words, BBB approaches the market for a floating rate borrowing and AA approaches the market for a fixed rate borrowing. Earlier cost was, just let us make a note of it, P plus 8%. That was the situation when both borrowed according to their requirements. Now, if they borrow contrary to their requirements, what happens? BBB borrows floating at prime plus 0.75% and AA borrows fixed at 6.5%. The total cost is prime plus 0.75 plus 6.5, that is prime plus 7.25%. So, in other words, by reversing the borrowing, there is something in the market, something in these rates rather, something encapsulated in these rates such that if I reverse the borrowings, I save 0.75%. So, what do they do? A simple logic, and the logic is that AA borrows at fixed rate, BBB borrows at floating rate, and thereafter they agree to share the spoils. In other words, what they do is this differential of 0.75% that they are able to save, they can share it among themselves in any agreed proportion. Need not be equal, it is subject to negotiation between these two parties. And in fact, if there is an intermediary or a market maker who is arranging all this, who is playing this game for them, who is getting everything organized, a certain cut can go to the market maker as well. The net result is that whatever goes to the BBB in terms of the saving in interest cost, whatever goes to AA in terms of saving in its interest cost, and whatever goes to that market maker in terms of its commission, the aggregate must be equal to 0.75%. So, let us look at the swap. A simple example of this where the distribution is equal. BBB borrows at the floating rate of prime plus 0.75 basis points, 0.75%, I am sorry. AA borrows fixed at 6.50%, and then what they do? They do the exchange. How they do it? Let us see. BBB, against this prime payment that it has to make, it receives a prime payment from the swap bank. This is the intermediary, market maker or organizer, whatever you like to call him. This is the market, this is the swap bank. The swap bank makes a payment of prime minus 0.25 basis point. BBB adds 1% of its own to it and pays prime plus 0.75% to the lenders. Now, it also pays 6.75% fixed to the swap bank. Now, the swap bank, what does it do? It takes a cut of 0.25% from this fixed rate and passes on 6.50% to the AA bank. Now, remember, AA bank had issued or had taken the loan at fixed rate, and it is getting a fixed rate stream of the same interest rate from the swap bank. So, these two streams cancel out. It is simply acting as a courier, receiving 6.50% fixed and passing it on to the lenders of the fixed rate funding, and it is also making up. So, this does not affect its status. It is making a payment of prime minus 0.25% to the swap bank, which is transferred unaltered to the BBB company, BBB corporation. So, what is the net result? The net result is that this prime and this prime cancel out. So, as far as BBB is concerned, it is making a fixed rate payment of 6.75% here plus 1% add on that it is giving here. So, the cost of funds to BBB is 7.75%. As far as AA is concerned, it is receiving 6.50%, passing on 6.50%. So, no change, but it is also paying prime minus 0.25% to the swap bank. So, its net cost is prime minus 0.25%. So, the net cost of both the parties is BBB 7.75% fixed and AA prime minus 0.25% floating, and swap bank gets a cut of 0.25%. Now, look at this, had they done as per their own requirements, the cost would have been 8%. Against that, it has got the money at 7.75%. AA bank would have paid prime rate. Instead of that, it has paid prime minus 0.25% and 0.25% they have paid for arranging the swap. Right. After the break, we will take up why this kind of situation happens. Thank you.